The rain in Lochdubh was not merely falling, it was performing a relentless grey assault on the spirit of any man who didn't have a warm hearth or a poaching licence to keep him occupied. PC Hamish Macbeth stood under the dripping eaves of the police station, a tall, spindly figure with a shock of red hair that even the Highland dampness couldn't quite tame. Beside him sat Lugs, a dog of such questionable lineage and magnificent ears that he appeared more like a failed experiment in taxidermy than a working animal. Hamish was currently engaged in his favourite form of police work, avoiding it. His hazel eyes were fixed on the silver-grey expanse of the loch, where a ripple suggested a salmon might be considering a move toward the river. He was mentally calculating the trajectory of his casting line when the silence was pierced by the high-pitched, mechanical whine of a luxury sports car navigating the narrow, potholed road into the village. The car was a Ferrari, a shade of red so aggressive it seemed to be insulting the very hills. It splashed through a deep puddle with a sound like a small explosion, drenching old Angus M.C. Clory's prize vegetable patch before screeching to a halt in front of the grocery store. Out stepped the Sassenach. Julian Vane, though the villagers would later discover his name was actually Vance, was the sort of Englishman who treated the Highlands like a theme park designed specifically for his amusement. He wore a cashmere coat that cost more than Hamish's annual salary and a pair of Italian leather shoes that were already beginning to weep at the touch of Scottish mud. He looked at the mist-shrouded peaks with the impatient expression of a man waiting for a slow elevator. "You there, Constable!" Vance shouted, his voice carrying that sharp metropolitan edge that set local teeth on edge. He pointed a manicured finger at the Ferrari. "This road is a disgrace. I've nearly bottomed out twice. Does the local council spend its entire budget on whiskey and bagpipes, or is there a genuine plan to pave this goat track?" Hamish detached himself from the wall with agonizing slowness. He adjusted his peaked cap and offered a smile that was a masterpiece of vacant rural politeness. "Och, it's the frost, sir. It has a way of lifting the tarmac. The hills don't like being pinned down, you see. And you'll be the new gentleman, moving into the old chapel on the crag?" Vance didn't bother to answer. He was busy wiping a spot of muddy water from his sleeve. "I'm here to bring some civilization to this damp corner of the world. I'm opening a boutique distillery. High-end, exclusive. Not the swill you people drink in tin mugs. I'll expect the law to keep a close eye on the site. I've already had some local urchins staring at my gates. Civilization is a fine thing, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a thick, syrupy Highland lilt that made him sound half-witted. "Though the urchins might just be the curry boys, they're mostly looking for their lost ferret. It has a taste for expensive electrical wiring, I'm told." Vance let out a huff of pure disdain and climbed back into his car, the engine roaring with a sound that sent Lugs scurrying for the safety of the kitchen. As the red blur sped off toward the crag, Hamish sighed. The piece of Lochdubh was a fragile thing, and men like Vance tended to treat it like a crystal vase they intended to smash for the insurance money. "He won't last the winter, Lugs," Hamish murmured, his eyes returning to the loch. "The Highlands have a way of chewing up the shiny ones and spitting out the chrome." He was about to return to his kitchen to see if there was enough coffee for a second pot when a much more ominous sound drifted down from the crag. It wasn't the roar of a Ferrari, but the steady, mournful tolling of the old chapel bell. It was a bell that hadn't been rung in 40 years, not since the last minister had been found dead in the vestry with a look of profound surprise on his face. Hamish froze. The salmon was forgotten. In Lochdubh, bells didn't just ring, they told stories. And this particular story sounded like it was going to involve a lot of paperwork and a very angry Detective Chief Inspector Blair. The tolling of the chapel bell continued, a heavy, iron-clung sound that seemed to thud against the low-hanging clouds and sink into the damp earth of the village. It was a rhythmic, insistent noise that signalled the end of Hamish Macbeth's tranquil morning and the beginning of a headache that no amount of coffee would be able to soothe. With a weary groan that mirrored the creak of the old police station's floorboards, Hamish grabbed his heavy Mac and whistled for Lugs. The dog, usually keen for a walk, looked toward the crag with his ears flattened against his skull, sensing the shift in the Highland air. They set off up the winding, muddy track that led toward the old chapel, the Ferrari's tyre tracks still fresh and deep in the mire, looking like scars on the face of the hill. As he climbed, the wind began to whistle through the stunted pines, a sharp, cold breath that carried the scent of salt and ancient stone. Hamish's mind was not on the beauty of the landscape, but on the logistics of the disturbance. The old chapel had been sold to Vance as a private residence, and the bell pull was located inside the main foyer. For it to be ringing meant that someone was either very desperate or very dead, and given the arrogance of the man who had just sped past him, Hamish suspected the latter would be far more inconvenient for everyone involved. By the time he reached the summit, the ringing had stopped, leaving a silence so absolute it felt physical. The red Ferrari was parked at a rakish angle near the chapel's heavy oak doors, one of which stood slightly ajar, groaning on its rusted hinges. Hamish paused at the threshold, his senses sharpening beneath his deceptively sleepy exterior. He took off his peaked cap, wiped his brow, and stepped inside. The air in the chapel was thick with the smell of floor wax, expensive cologne, and something metallic and sharp that didn't belong in a house of God. The interior had been gutted of its pews and replaced with minimalist cold furniture that looked like it had been designed for a spaceship rather than a Highland retreat. In the centre of the room, beneath the heavy velvet rope of the bell pull, lay Julian Vance. He was no longer the picture of metropolitan sophistication. He was flat on his back, his mouth open in a silent cry, and his neck was entangled in the very bell rope he had presumably been trying to silence or perhaps summon help with. What made the scene truly bizarre, and in a dark Highland way slightly humiliating, was the fact that Vance was dressed in a traditional, albeit garish kilt outfit that he had clearly put on to celebrate his new status as a local laird. The kilt was pleated wrongly. The sporran was hanging at a jaunty, incorrect angle, and a bottle of his own exclusive boutique gin lay shattered beside his head, the clear liquid soaking into the wool of his tartan like a libation to a god of bad taste. He had tripped, it seemed, and in falling had managed to loop the heavy rope around his throat, while the momentum of the bell's heavy tongue did the rest. It was a clumsy, undignified end for a man who had wanted to bring civilization to Lochdubh. Hamish knelt beside the body, careful not to disturb the glass shards. He didn't need to check for a pulse. Vance's eyes were fixed on the vaulted ceiling with an expression of profound irritation, as if he were still annoyed by the lack of paving on the road. Luggs gave a low, mournful whine from the doorway, refusing to enter the desecrated space. Hamish sighed, his hazel eyes scanning the room. He noted the position of the feet, the way the silk scarf was snagged on a nearby antique coat rack, and the curious fact that while the front door was open, the back vestry door was bolted from the inside. It looked like an accident, a classic, clumsy Sassenach mishap, but there was a nagging feeling in the back of Hamish's mind that didn't sit right. He reached out and touched the kilt pin. It was a silver stag, sharp and heavy. It seemed to have been pinned through not just the wool, but through a small, folded piece of paper tucked into the waistband. Hamish didn't touch the paper yet. He knew the rules. He knew that in less than an hour the quiet of the crag would be shattered by the arrival of the Strathbane police, and if he were found meddling with evidence, Blair would have his head on a platter. He stood up, feeling the coldness of the stone floor seeping through the soles of his boots. He was hungry. He was damp. And now he was the primary witness to a death that would bring the eyes of the national press to his tiny hidden village. The walk back down to the police station to make the dreaded phone call was the longest Hamish had ever taken. He passed the grocery store where Mrs. Kennedy was already standing on the pavement, her arms crossed and her eyes narrowed with suspicion. The news of the bell had travelled through the village at the speed of a wireless signal. "What was it, Hamish?" she called out, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Did that Englishman find the ghost of the old minister, or did he just realise he'd run out of tonic water?" Hamish offered a vague wave of his hand, his face a mask of official dullness. "Just a bit of a tumble, Mrs. Kennedy. Nothing for the ladies to worry about just yet." He knew that by the time he reached the station, the rumours would have Vance murdered by a cult, abducted by aliens, or wedded to a Kelpie. Such was the nature of Lochdubh gossip. It filled the gaps that the truth was too slow to occupy. He entered the station and stared at the black telephone on his desk. It looked like an unexploded bomb. He picked up the receiver and dialed the number for the Strathbane headquarters, leaning back in his chair and closing his eyes as the line rang. He could almost smell the cheap cigarettes and the city's overheated office air. When the voice answered, Hamish adopted his thickest, most bumbling Highland accent, the one that made the city detectives think his brain was made of porridge. "Aye, it's Macbeth here. In Lochdubh, we had a little situation at the old chapel. The new gentleman, Mr. Vance, well, he's gone and tangled himself in the bell rope. Aye, he's dead as a salted herring. You might want to tell Detective Chief Inspector Blair, and tell him to bring his wellies. The mud is something fierce today." He hung up and let out a long, slow breath. The piece was officially over. Within the hour, the circus would arrive, led by the loudest clown in the constabulary. Hamish looked at Luggs, who had slumped down by the radiator. "We'd better have a piece of toast while we can, lad," Hamish muttered, "because once Blair gets here, there won't be a moment's rest until he's found someone to blame, and I've a nasty feeling he's going to start with the first person he sees." He moved toward the kitchen, his mind already returning to the image of the silver stag pin and the piece of paper. Why would a man who had just arrived in the village be carrying a note in his kilt? And why did the bell ring with such a steady, deliberate rhythm if it were the result of a frantic, accidental fall? The questions were like gnats, buzzing around his head, and Hamish knew that the only way to quiet them was to sit, wait, and listen to what the village had to say while the experts were busy shouting at the walls. The first distant wail of a siren began to echo through the glen, a jagged sound that tore through the mist. It was coming from the south, fast and aggressive. Hamish put the kettle on the stove, his movements deliberate and calm. He had a very short window of time before his life became a series of insults and orders. He looked out the window at the hills, which were now disappearing into a heavy violet twilight. The murder, if it was a murder, was a dark blot on the landscape, but as the water began to whistle in the kettle, Hamish felt the familiar, cold sharpening of his instincts. Julian Vance had come to Lochdubh to make a splash, and he had certainly succeeded. Now, it was up to the useless local policeman to figure out who had helped him into his final, silent curtain call, before the rest of the world decided that Lochdubh was a place where only the bells told the truth. The kettle's whistle grew louder, a sharp contrast to the approaching sirens that were now rounding the final bend into the village. Hamish poured the boiling water into his chipped mug, the steam rising to meet the dampness of his hair. He knew that Blair would arrive red-faced and sweating, despite the cold, ready to stomp over every clue with his heavy-handed arrogance. He would see a clumsy Englishman and a freak accident. But Hamish had seen the way the velvet rope was coiled, not in a random tangle, but in a neat professional loop that suggested someone in Lochdubh knew a great deal more about bells and ropes than they let on. He took a sip of the scalding coffee, feeling the heat spread through his chest. The game was afoot, though to anyone watching, it would only look like a lazy policeman waiting for his boss to arrive. He would let Blair shout, he would let Blair arrest the wrong person, and he would let Blair take the credit in the end, because the only thing Hamish Macbeth feared more than a killer was a promotion that would take him away from the rain, the loch, and the deceptive peace of the Highland hills. As the first police car screeched to a halt outside, splashing mud against the station window, Hamish wiped his mouth, put on his cap, and prepared himself for the storm. The door to the station burst open before the engine of the lead car had even stopped vibrating. It wasn't a knock, it was an invasion. The cold air of the Highlands rushed in, followed immediately by the scent of peppermint and unbridled rage. DCI Blair stood in the doorway, his chest heaving, his face the colour of a bruised plum. He looked at Hamish, then at the half-finished coffee, and let out a sound that was somewhere between a growl and a sob of frustration. The investigation had officially begun, and the peace of Lochdubh was now nothing more than a memory. drowned out by the heavy footsteps of a man who didn't understand that in the Highlands the most important things are always said in a whisper. Hamish stood up slowly, his face carefully blank, ready to be the peasant that Blair expected him to be, while his mind was already back at the chapel, wondering who had been strong enough to pull that rope, and silent enough to vanish before the first toll of the bell had even reached the village below. DCI Blair didn't so much walk into the room as collide with the atmosphere, his presence a jarring urban cacophony that seemed to vibrate the very dust on the police station shelves. He was followed by Detectives Anderson and McLean, who looked like two men who had been dragged through a hedge backwards and then told they couldn't have their supper. Blair's eyes, small and inflamed like those of a cornered pig, fixed on Hamish with a look of pure, concentrated loathing. He stomped across the linoleum, his breath hitching in his chest, and slammed a meaty hand down on the duty desk. "Macbeth!" he roared, the sound causing lugs to retreat so far under the radiator that only a wet nose remained visible. "I knew it! I knew the moment the call came through that you'd be sitting here nursing a brew while a prominent businessman is currently swinging from his own rafters. You couldn't just have a quiet weekend, could you? You had to go and let a millionaire get himself strangled in a church." Hamish remained standing, his posture a masterpiece of slumping rural subservience. He looked at Blair with wide, blinkered eyes, the very image of a man whose most complex thought of the day involved the consistency of his porridge. "Oh, now, sir, he's not swinging exactly," Hamish said, his voice dropping into a slow, rhythmic Highland drawl. "He's more resting on the floor. It was the rope that did the job. A very tragic tumble. The mud on the crag is something terrible this morning, and him with those slippery Italian shoes." Blair let out a sound like a boiling kettle. "Accident? You're telling me a man of Julian Vance's stature, a man who has just invested millions into this damp scrap of heather, decided to go into a chapel, put on a kilt, and then accidentally hang himself while ringing a bell? You take me for a fool, Macbeth. Don't answer that. I know what you think of the city force, you lanky streak of nothing." He turned to Anderson and McLean, waving a thick arm toward the door. "Get the cars moving. I want that chapel sealed tighter than a miser's purse. I want forensics in there. I want the photographer. And I want that body processed before the local crows start thinking it's a buffet." He turned back to Hamish, poking a rigid finger into his chest. "As for you, you're grounded. Stay here. Don't go wandering off to talk to the postmistress or whichever local gossip you use for a brain trust. You've contaminated enough of my crime scenes in the past. This is a high-profile case, Macbeth. This is London money. This is international news. The last thing I need is a Highland bobby with Pete in his ears trampling over the footprints." Hamish nodded vaguely, his face a mask of dull compliance. "Whatever you say, sir, I'll just be here, tidying the cupboards. It's a bit of a mess, as you can see." Blair gave a final, disgusted snort and stormed back out into the sleet, his subordinates scurrying in his wake like frantic beetles. The station door slammed shut with a force that rattled the glass. A moment later, the aggressive scream of sirens drifted back up toward the crag. Hamish waited until the sound had faded into the distance before he slowly sat back down. He didn't look like a man who had been grounded. He looked like a man who had just been given the afternoon off to do exactly what he wanted. He knew Blair's methods. The DCI would go up to the chapel, see the shattered gin bottle, see the tangled rope, and immediately look for someone to shout at. He would likely settle on the most obvious ruffian in the village, probably young Geordie or one of the Curries, and drag them into an interview room until they confessed to something they hadn't done just to make the shouting stop. But Hamish was thinking about the kilt. Julian Vance was a man of immense vanity, a man who viewed himself as a brand. For him to be found in a kilt that was put on backwards with a sporran at the wrong angle suggested one of two things. Either he was so drunk he didn't know his front from his back, or someone had dressed him after he was dead. The shattered bottle of gin was too convenient. It was the sort of detail a city detective like Blair would love. The drunken Sassenach playing at being a Highlander and paying the price for his hubris. But Hamish had seen the silver stag pin. He had seen the way it had been deliberately used to secure that small, folded piece of paper. A man who is accidentally hanging himself doesn't stop to pin a note to his own waistband. Hamish stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. He knew he couldn't go back to the chapel, not yet. Blair would have officers stationed at every entrance. Instead, he needed to do what he did best. He needed to mooch. He whistled for Lugs, who emerged from under the radiator with a look of profound relief. "Come on, lad," Hamish muttered, pulling his Mac back on. "We're going for a bit of a stroll. If anyone asks, we're looking for a lost cat. It's a very important cat, very elusive." He slipped out the back door of the station, avoiding the main street where the village was currently, buzzing like a disturbed beehive. He took the narrow path behind the cottages, the mud squelching under his boots. His first stop was not the hotel or the shop, but the small, corrugated iron shed near the harbour where Archie McLean kept his nets and his secrets. Archie was a man who saw everything that came and went from Lochdubh, mostly because he spent half his life looking for things he could salvage from the shoreline. The shed smelled of salt, rotted kelp, and the cheap, biting tobacco Archie favoured. The old fisherman was sitting on an overturned crate, meticulously mending a hole in a heavy nylon net. He didn't look up when Hamish entered. He simply pointed a gnarled finger toward a thermos of tea sitting on a nearby bench. "He's dead, then, the shiny one," Archie said, his voice like grinding gravel. "Heard the bell. I knew it wasn't the wind. The wind has a high voice, but that bell has a voice like a dead man's lung." Hamish poured himself a cup of the thick, stewed tea and leaned against the wall. "Aye, he's dead, Archie. Tangled in the rope. DCI Blair thinks he was drunk and playing the fool in a kilt. What did you see this morning? You were down by the pier when the red car came in." Archie finally looked up, his eyes milky with age but sharp with observation. "I saw the car, like a big red wound it was. But I saw something else, Macbeth, something the city men won't care about. I saw the minister's old bicycle, the one with the rusted basket. It was leaning against the chapel wall an hour before the bell rang. Now, why would a dead man's bicycle be visiting a new distillery? And why was it gone by the time the sirens started?" Hamish felt a familiar chill, one that had nothing to do with the Highland damp. The old minister's bicycle was a relic, supposedly sold off at an auction years ago after the man's heart had given out in that very chapel. If someone was using it now, they were someone who knew the village's history, someone who knew that the old chapel was more than just a boutique distillery site. "The kilt, Archie," Hamish said, staring into his tea. "It was the Emmexy Ray tartan. Vance didn't have McRae's blood in him. He told me he was going to buy his way into a clan. Did anyone in the village take offence to that? Someone who takes their history a bit too seriously?" Archie cackled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "In Lochdubh, everyone takes offence to everything, Macbeth, you know that. But if you're looking for a messeray with a grudge and a taste for old bicycles, you might want to ask the postmistress who's been receiving letters from the Land Registry Office lately. There's a bit of a dispute about who actually owned the chapel's graveyard. Vance wanted to turn it into a car park. Some folks think the dead should stay where they're put." Hamish finished his tea and set the cup down. The investigation was already branching out. Moving away from the accident, Blair was so eager to sign off on and into the murky, peat-stained waters of village tradition and property law. He thanked Archie and retreated into the rain. He needed to find Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She moved in the social circles Vance had been so desperate to join, and she would know if the Sassenach had stepped on the wrong toes before he'd even uncorked his first bottle of gin. As he walked, the image of the bell rope returned to him, the way it had been looped, the way the bell had tolled. It hadn't been a frantic clanging, it had been a measured funereal pace. Someone hadn't just killed Julian Vance. They had conducted a service for him, and in the Highlands a service was never just about the dead, it was a warning to the living. Hamish pulled his cap lower against the wind, his mind already far ahead of the sirens and the shouting, searching for the whisper that would explain why the chapel bell had finally found its voice again. Hamish left Archie McLean's shed with the smell of rotted kelp clinging to his mac and the image of a rusted bicycle pedalling through his mind like a ghostly recurring dream. The sleet had turned into a steady, soaking drizzle that blurred the outlines of the cottages, making the village feel even more isolated and insular than usual. He knew he had to be careful. Blair would have his men patrolling the main street, and the last thing Hamish needed was to be hauled back to the station for disobeying a direct order before he'd even begun to scratch the surface of Vance's demise. He kept to the shadows of the stone walls, his lanky frame moving with a deceptive, liquid ease that allowed him to vanish into the grey landscape. His destination was the Tommel Castle Hotel, specifically the back entrance where the kitchen staff took their breaks. In Lochdubh, the front of the house saw the smiles and the tips, but the back of the house saw the dirty laundry and the unpaid bills. As he reached the hotel's rear courtyard, the steam from the industrial dishwashers billowed out into the cold air, smelling of dish soap and overboiled cabbage. Standing by the bins was Mrs. Gillespie, the head cook, a woman whose temper was as legendary as her steak and kidney pie. She was currently attacking a cigarette as if it were a personal enemy, her face pinched with a mixture of cold and irritation. When she saw Hamish emerge from the mist, she didn't look surprised. In her world, the local policeman was just another hungry mouth that occasionally needed a bit of direction. "If you're looking for a scone, Macbeth, you're too late," she barked, though she didn't tell him to leave. "The kitchen is in an uproar. Some city detective with a face like a slapped ham has been in here demanding the guest list and shouting about international incidents. As if we don't have enough to do with the winter menu." Hamish leaned against the damp stone wall, looking for all the world like a man with nothing but time on his hands. "Och, that'll be DCI Blair. He has a very loud way of introducing himself." "I'm just looking for a bit of quiet, Mrs. Gillespie. It's a sad business about Mr. Vance. He was staying here while the chapel was being renovated, wasn't he?" Mrs. Gillespie snorted, a plume of smoke escaping her nostrils. "Staying here? He was haunting the place. Complained about the thread count of the sheets, complained about the lack of avocado at breakfast, and complained most of all about the locals trespassing on his crag. He had a row in the dining room only last night that had the other guests staring into their soup just to avoid the splash zone." Hamish tilted his head, his eyes sharpening. A row? And who was he fighting with? Another disgruntled visitor? Mrs. Gillespie shook her head, her multiple chins wobbling with the effort. Not a visitor. It was Mr. Forbes, Drim's lawyer. You know the one, always looks like he's just swallowed a wasp. Forbes was telling him that he couldn't just dig up the chapel graveyard, and Vance told him he'd dig up whatever he pleased because he owned the dirt and everything under it. Then Vance said something that turned Forbes white. He said, "I know why you're so protective of those stones, Arthur. I've seen the old church records you tried to bin." Hamish felt a tug on the line. Property disputes were common enough in the Highlands, but for a city man like Vance to be digging into old church records suggested he was looking for more than just a place to park his Ferrari. "And did anyone else see this?" Hamish asked softly. Mrs. Gillespie flicked her cigarette butt into a puddle with a hiss. The whole room heard it, but it was the way Vance laughed afterward that was the worst, like he'd already won a game we didn't know we were playing. He left shortly after, saying he had an appointment at the chapel for a private viewing. He was wearing that ridiculous kilt even then, strutting about like he'd personally invented the Macrae clan. Hamish thanked her and began to move away, but her voice caught him at the edge of the courtyard. "Hamish! If you find out who did it, don't be too hard on them." The man had a walking headache. He told me my gravy was pedestrian. No man deserves to live after an insult like that. Hamish continued his mooching expedition, his mind spinning with the new information. Forbes the solicitor was a man of impeccable reputation and very little humour, exactly the kind of person who would view a threat to his professional standing as a capital offence. And then there was the mention of the church records. If Vance had found something in those old ledgers, it would explain why he was dressed in the MC Ray tartan. The misty Rays had been the dominant family in the area for centuries, but their line had supposedly died out in the 50s, leaving their lands to be absorbed into various trusts and estates. If Vance had discovered a surviving heir, or perhaps proof that the lands were never legally sold, he would have had a motive for blackmail that would make a boutique distillery look like small change. He decided it was time to check the village's unofficial intelligence hub, the Spice of Lochdubh curry shop. It was run by Mr. Patel, a man who had moved from Birmingham to find peace and quiet, and instead found himself at the centre of every rumour within a 20-mile radius. The shop was empty of customers, the air thick with the comforting scent of cumin and frying onions. Mr. Patel was polishing the counter with a cloth that had seen better decades. "A bad day for business, Hamish," Mr. Patel said, his Birmingham accent still thick despite his years in the north. "The police have blocked the road to the crag, and the tourists are all staying in their rooms. Is it true what they're saying? That the Englishman was strangled by a ghost?" Hamish sat on a stool, resting his cap on the counter. "The only ghost in that chapel is the one Blair is trying to catch, Mr. Patel. But tell me, did you see anyone on a bicycle this morning? A rusted old thing with a basket?" Mr. Patel paused, his cloth hovering over a smudge of grease. "I did. About 7 o'clock. It was the minister's old bike, right enough. I thought it was just the wind moving it at first, but someone was riding it. They were wearing a heavy black oilskin, the kind the trawlermen wear. They went up the back path toward the chapel and came back down about 40 minutes later, just before the bell started its music." Hamish leaned in. "And did you see the face?" Mr. Patel shook his head. The hood was up and the mist was thick. "But they weren't in a hurry, Hamish. That was a strange thing. They pedalled back down the hill as if they were coming back from a Sunday picnic. They stopped right outside the post office, leaned the bike against the wall, and walked away toward the harbour. I assumed it was just one of the locals playing a prank, but then the sirens started. The harbour again. Archie McLean's territory. Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle beginning to click into place, but they were forming a picture that was increasingly dark. A man dressed as a clan chief, a disputed graveyard, and a killer who moved with the calm, rhythmic certainty of a church bell. He left the shop and headed toward the post office, but as he crossed the street, he saw Blair's car returning from the crag. The DCI looked even more furious than before, his face a vivid shade of magenta, as he barked orders at a huddle of locals who were trying to look busy doing nothing. Hamish ducked into the doorway of the chemist's shop to avoid being spotted. He watched as Blair stormed into the police station, followed by Anderson, who was carrying an evidence bag that looked suspiciously like it contained the silver stag pin Hamish had seen earlier. Blair was moving fast, driven by the need for an easy arrest. He would be looking for a scapegoat, and with Forbes the solicitor and the ghost of the MC Ray clan lurking in the background, the useless local policeman knew he had very little time to find the truth before Blair's heavy-handed justice ruined an innocent life. Hamish stood in the doorway, the rain dripping from the brim of his cap. He realized that the Sassenach had been murdered not because of his money or his arrogance, but because he had tried to claim an identity that wasn't his to take. In the Highlands you could buy the land, and you could buy the house, but you couldn't buy the blood. And someone in Lochdubh had decided to show Julian Vance exactly what happened to those who tried to play at being a Highlander without understanding the weight of the ropes they were pulling. He needed to find that bicycle, and he needed to find out who had the keys to the old church records before Blair decided that the best way to solve a mystery was to shout it into submission. As the heavy grey afternoon faded into an early watery dusk, Hamish felt the first stirrings of a plan. A mooching, deceptive Highland plan that would require a great deal of tea and an even greater amount of silence. The dampness of the evening seemed to seep into Hamish's bones as he steered his lanky frame away from the village centre, heading up the winding rhododendron-lined drive of Tommel Castle. The grand stone edifice loomed out of the mist like a brooding prehistoric beast, its windows glowing with a dim, yellow light that spoke of old money and deep-seated boredom. Hamish knew that if anyone could bridge the gap between Julian Vance's brash London ambitions and the murky undercurrents of Lochdubh's history, it was Priscilla Halberton Smythe. She had the unfortunate habit of seeing right through Hamish's lazy Bobby act, but she also possessed a sharp, cynical intelligence that was currently worth more to him than a dozen of Blair's forensic teams. He was met at the side door by the butler, a man who looked at Hamish's dripping mac as if it were a personal insult to the carpet, and was eventually ushered into the small morning room. Priscilla was standing by the fireplace, the light of the dancing flames glinting off her golden hair. She held a glass of sherry and looked at Hamish with an expression that was half amused and half wary. "I heard the bell, Hamish," she said, her voice a cool, aristocratic chime, "and I saw the Ferrari being towed away like a bright red carcass. I assume Julian has finally managed to offend someone to the point of extinction." Hamish dropped into a velvet armchair with a weary sigh, lugs settling onto the rug with a heavy thud. "He's dead, Priscilla. Tied up in the bell rope like a Christmas parcel, and dressed in a macrame kilt that didn't fit him in life or in death. DCI Blair is currently trying to arrest the wind, but I'm more interested in what Vance was doing before he went up to that chapel. Mrs. Gillespie says he had a row with Forbes, the solicitor, about church records and graveyards." Priscilla sat opposite him, her eyes narrowing. Julian was an insufferable climber, Hamish, but he was a clever one. He didn't just want a distillery, he wanted a lineage. He'd become obsessed with the idea that the MC Ray estate hadn't been properly settled after the last of the family died out. He told me last week that he'd found a discrepancy in the parish ledgers, something about a son born out of wedlock who had a legal claim to the chapel and the surrounding glen. If Julian could prove the current owners didn't have a clear title, he could have bought the whole area for a song or blackmailed them into a partnership. Hamish leaned forward, the warmth of the fire beginning to draw the dampness from his tweed. And Forbes? Why would a solicitor from Drim care so much about a dead clan and a dusty ledger? Priscilla took a small sip of her sherry, her gaze fixed on the flames. "Arthur Forbes's family has managed the MC Ray interests for 3 generations, Hamish. If it came out that there was a legitimate heir, or that the Forbes family had been, shall we say, efficient with the estate's assets over the years, it would be the end of his practice. But there's more. Julian mentioned a name to me. He asked if I knew a John Mac Ray who worked at the harbour. He thought it was a joke, a common labourer having the name of a fallen dynasty." Hamish felt the click of a lock in his mind. John Mac Ray was the name of a quiet, unassuming man who helped Archie MacLean with the nets. A man who lived in a small, windowless cabin by the water and rarely spoke a word to anyone. If Vance had gone to that cabin with his arrogant talk of discovery and rightful heirs, he might have stirred a hornet's nest that had been dormant for half a century. "The kilt," Hamish murmured. "It wasn't just a costume, it was a taunt. Someone dressed him in it to show him that the blood he was trying to buy didn't want him." Priscilla watched him, her face softening slightly. "Blair won't see any of this, you know. He'll find a bottle of gin and call it a day, or he'll pick a local boy and break him. You're the only one who cares about the truth of it, Hamish, even if you do pretend you'd rather be fishing." Hamish stood, his joints creaking. The information was vital, but it was also heavy. He thought of the rusted bicycle leaning against the post office wall and the man in the black oilskin. The mystery was no longer a series of random events. It was a straight line leading from the harbour to the chapel crag. "Thank you, Priscilla," Hamish said, picking up his cap. "I'd best get back before Blair notices I've escaped the station. He's in a hanging mood, and I'd rather it wasn't my neck in the rope this time." Priscilla walked him to the door, the cold night air rushing in as she opened it. "Be careful, Hamish. Lochdubh has a way of protecting its own, and sometimes that protection is just as lethal as the crime itself. If Julian Vance went digging in the graveyard, he shouldn't have been surprised when something crawled out." Hamish stepped back into the dark, the rain now a fine, freezing mist. He whistled for lugs and began the long walk back down toward the harbour. The castle loomed behind him, a symbol of the old order that Vance had tried to infiltrate, But ahead of him lay the water and the small, dark cabins where the real history of the Highlands was kept in silence. He needed to find John MacRae, and he needed to do it before the circus at the station decided that justice was best served by shouting at the first person who couldn't afford a solicitor. As he walked, the measured toll of the chapel bell seemed to echo in his mind again, not as a sound, but as a warning. The FC Rays might have been a fallen dynasty, but in the Highlands, the dead never truly stayed put when their dignity was at stake. He reached the bottom of the drive and paused, looking toward the faint lights of the harbour. Somewhere in that darkness a rusted bicycle was waiting, and Hamish Macbeth intended to find the person who had peddled it into the pages of a murder investigation. He adjusted his cap, pulled his Mac tight, and vanished into the shadows of the stone walls, the lazy policeman now a hunter in his own quiet, deceptive way. The descent from the castle was a treacherous scramble through the sodden heather, the mist clinging to Hamish's face like a cold, wet cobweb. He moved with a sense of urgency that would have baffled DCI Blair, his mind racing through the social hierarchy of Lochdubh to the very bottom, where the silent men of the sea lived. As he approached the village outskirts, the silence was suddenly shattered by the aggressive blare of a police megaphone. The sound drifted from the police station, jagged and discordant. Hamish skirted around the back of the schoolhouse and peered through the shadows. The station was a hive of frantic, misplaced energy. Blair had finally found his victim. Standing in the harsh glare of the station's floodlights was Geordie Curry, the village's most frequent but least capable petty thief. The boy looked terrified, his thin frame shaking as Blair loomed over him, waving a clear plastic evidence bag that contained the silver stag pin. "I found it in your pocket, you little maggot!" Blair's roar was audible even from the schoolhouse. "A unique antique pin from the victim's own collection. Don't tell me you found it in the gutter. You went up to that chapel to rob him, he caught you, and you did him in with the rope." Hamish watched from the darkness, his heart sinking. Geordie was a light-fingered lad with a penchant for lead piping and unattended garden gnomes, but he didn't have the stomach for a fight, let alone the cold-blooded precision required to rig a bell-rope execution. More importantly, Geordie couldn't ride a bicycle to save his life. He'd fallen off a stationary one 3 years ago and broken his arm, a fact that was well recorded in the local clinic's files. Blair was currently performing a masterclass in wrong-headedness, seizing on the most convenient culprit to satisfy the higher-ups in Strathbane. The stag pin was a classic plant, a shiny piece of bait designed to distract the professional police while the real killer went about their business. Hamish knew he had to act before Blair dragged the boy off to a cell in the city, but he couldn't just walk in and tell the truth. Blair didn't want the truth. He wanted a result. Hamish whistled low for lugs and turned away from the spectacle, heading toward the harbour. He needed to find the source of the frame-up. If the pin had been in Geordie's pocket, it meant someone had put it there, and in a village as small as Lochdubh, there were very few people who could get close enough to the slippery curry boy to pick his pocket without him noticing. He reached the port wall, where black water hit the stone with a rhythmic sucking sound. The rusted bicycle was gone from the post office, but a fresh trail of mud and oil led directly toward the small, windowless cabin occupied by John MacRae. The cabin sat apart from the others, a weathered structure of driftwood and corrugated iron that seemed to be trying to sink back into the shore. As Hamish approached, he saw a flicker of movement behind the single, salt-crusted pane of glass. He didn't knock. In the Highlands, a knock was a challenge. A gentle scrape of the boot on the threshold was an invitation. He waited, the rain dripping from his ears, until the door creaked open an inch. John MacRae stood there, a man who looked like he had been fashioned out of old rope and oak. His eyes were deep-set and unreadable, reflecting nothing of the storm outside. "Macbeth," the man said, his voice a low vibration that seemed to come from his boots. "The city men are making a lot of noise up the hill. They've caught a thief, I hear." Hamish leaned against the doorframe, his posture one of exhausted indifference. "Aye, they've caught Geordie Curry. Blair thinks he's the Moriarty of the Highlands because he had a silver pin in his pocket. But you and I both know Geordie couldn't find his own feet in the dark, John. and we both know that the pin belonged to a man who was trying to steal a name that didn't belong to him. McRae didn't move, but the air around him seemed to grow colder, a name that all some folks have left, Macbeth. When the land is gone and the money is gone, the name is the only thing the lawyers can't put in a box. Hamish looked past him into the cabin. On the small wooden table sat a black oilskin, still glistening with moisture. Beside it lay a pair of heavy shears and a stack of old, yellowed ledgers, the parish records that Julian Vance had claimed were his ticket to a dynasty. The red herring of Geordie Curry was unravelling in the face of a much older, much more calculated reality. Vance hadn't just discovered a discrepancy, he had tried to buy his way into a lineage that considered him an infection. But as Hamish looked at the old man, he realised that John McRae, for all his strength, moved with a heavy, arthritic limp. He couldn't have pedalled that rusted bicycle up the crag and back down again in 40 minutes. He was the motive, perhaps, but he wasn't the hand on the rope. "Someone did it for you, John," Hamish said softly, the realisation hitting him with the force of a Highland gale. "Someone who cares about the MC Ray name more than they care about the law. Someone who knew exactly where Geordie Curry would be hiding his latest loot so they could drop that pin into his coat." McRae stepped back into the cabin's shadows, his face obscured. "The bell rang for a funeral, Macbeth. It's not a crime to bury what's already dead." Hamish felt the pieces of the puzzle shift again. The killer wasn't a ghost, and they weren't a city solicitor protecting a practice. They were someone who viewed Julian Vance as a desecration, a man who had to be removed with the same clinical efficiency one would use on a diseased sheep. He turned back toward the harbour, the image of the man in the black oilskin returning to his mind. The red herring was Blair's triumph, but for Hamish it was a clock ticking. He had to find the cyclist before Blair's justice became permanent and the real killer vanished into the mist of the hills. The harbour was silent, the boats bobbing like ghosts, but Hamish knew that somewhere nearby the rusted bicycle was being dismantled, and the person who had pulled the rope was watching him from the dark. He adjusted his cap, his hazel eyes scanning the shoreline, ready to set a trap that didn't involve megaphones or floodlights. But the one thing the people of Lochdubh couldn't resist, a bit of well-placed gossip. The damp salt air of the harbour seemed to thicken, pressing against Hamish as he watched John McRae retreat into the lightless cavern of his cabin. Blair's relentless shouting was currently gutting up the red herring of Geordie Curry at the station, but here in the shadows, the true motive was breathing. Hamish knew he couldn't force a confession out of a man who looked like he had been carved out of a storm-beaten cliff, but he also knew that John McRae lacked the mobility to be the ghost on the bicycle. The motive was clear, preserving a bloodline that Julian Vance had tried to commodify like a cheap souvenir. Vance had been a man who collected things, cars, companies, and eventually a heritage that wasn't his. He had likely threatened to expose some stain on the Messi Ray lineage, or, worse, prove that the humble labourer John was the last of a noble line, dragging a man who loved the silence of the sea into the garish light of a London courtroom for a property dispute. Hamish turned away from the cabin, his boots crunching softly on the shingle. He did not return to the village. Instead, he moved toward the old pier where the local ferry used to dock, a place now largely abandoned except for the storage of rusted lobster creels and the skeletal remains of forgotten boats. He needed to find the person who had acted as John's hands and feet, someone strong, someone invisible, and someone with a loyalty that transcended the modern laws Blair held so dear. As he walked, he began to hum a low, tuneless whistle, the sound a signal to the darkness. In Lochdubh, if you wanted to catch a fox, you didn't set a steel trap in the middle of the road. You left a bit of bait near the hole and waited for the wind to do the work. He stopped near a stack of rotting timber and leaned back, pulling a crumpled packet of cigarettes from his pocket. He didn't light one, he just held it, appearing for all the world like a man who had reached the end of his tether and given up on the day. Lugg sat beside him, his massive ears twitching toward the sound of someone moving behind a nearby shed. The footsteps were light, practiced, and entirely without the heavy-handed thud of the police. "It's a cold night for a bike ride, Arthur," Hamish said to the darkness, his voice conversational and devoid of threat. The silence stretched for a long minute before Arthur Forbes, the solicitor, stepped out from behind the shed. He wasn't wearing his usual pinstriped suit. He was dressed in a heavy black fisherman's oilskin, the very one Mr. Patel had described. The hood was down now, revealing a face that looked 10 years older than it had at the hotel. His eyes were wide and glittering with a mixture of terror and a strange, defiant pride. He wasn't carrying his briefcase. He was holding a heavy iron spanner, his knuckles white from the grip. "You were always too observant for your own good, Macbeth," Forbes said, his voice trembling but his gaze steady. "Blair would have had that boy in Strathbane by morning. Why couldn't you just let it be? Vance was a parasite. He was going to destroy everything." Hamish didn't move. He kept his hands in his pockets, the very picture of deceptive laziness. "You found the records, didn't you, Arthur? The ones you'd been hiding for years. The ones that proved the Forbes family hadn't just been managing the McC estate, but had been siphoning it dry to pay for that big house in Drim and the fancy education for your girls. Vance didn't mind the McRaes. He wanted to use that proof to force you to sign over the chapel and the glen for his distillery. He was going to ruin you and strip John McRae of the only thing he had left, his peace." Forbes took a step forward, the spanner glinting in the pale moonlight that struggled through the clouds. "He laughed at me, Hamish. He sat in that chapel, wearing a kilt he'd bought off a rack, and told me he was the new king of the glen. He said John was a relic and that I was a clerk who had outlived his usefulness. He deserved the rope. He deserved to be hung like the thief he was." Hamish felt sympathy for the man. Forbes wasn't a killer by nature. He was a man who had been backed into a corner by a predator who didn't understand that even a clerk has a breaking point. But more than that, Forbes felt a medieval loyalty to the McRae name, a guilt-ridden devotion to the family his ancestors had served and he had robbed. "The bell, Arthur," Hamish said softly. "Why ring the bell? You could have walked away. You could have left him there and no one would have known for days. But you rang it. You rang it with a rhythm that only an old local would know." Forbes looked up toward the crag, where the dark silhouette of the chapel stood against the sky. "It was a passing bell, Macbeth. A man shouldn't go into the dark without a sound to guide him, even a man like Julian. And I wanted John to hear it. I wanted him to know the threat was gone. I used the minister's bike because it was silent. I knew everyone would think it was a ghost if they saw it in the mist. I didn't think of mud or oil. I just thought about the name." Hamish looked at Forbes and then Luggs. The solicitor was a broken man, his pride shattered by the very act he had committed to save it. But the law, as Blair interpreted it, was a blunt instrument. If Hamish handed Forbes over now, the trial would be a circus. The McRae name would be dragged through the mud Vance had so loved, and John McRae would be left homeless and hounded by the press. Hamish needed a way to satisfy the job requirements without destroying the fragile ecosystem of the village he called home. He also knew Blair was now preparing to charge Geordie Curry, an act that would be a stain on the department's reputation if it went to court. "You did a foolish thing, Arthur," Hamish said, finally straightening up and tossing the unlit cigarette into the water. "Putting that pin in Geordie's pocket was a city man's trick. It was too neat, too perfect. It was the only thing that made me sure it wasn't a crime of passion." Forbes slumped, the spanner falling from his hand and hitting the gravel with a dull thud. He looked at Hamish with a plea in his eyes that was hard to ignore. "What happens now? Are you going to call him? Are you going to let Blair have his triumph?" Hamish didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the loch, listening to the water. He had a plan, one that involved a bit of deceptive theatre and a great deal of Highland silence, but it would require Forbes to play a part he wasn't prepared for. "I'm going to go for a walk, Arthur," Hamish said, his voice low and steady. "And you're going to go back to your office. You're going to find those records, the real ones, and you're going to make sure they're placed where they can be found by someone who isn't a vulture. And then we're going to see if DCI Blair can be convinced that his prize suspect isn't a thief, but a witness." As Hamish walked away, leaving the solicitor standing alone on the pier, He knew the trap was only half set. He needed to guide the circus toward the truth without letting them know they'd been led, all while ensuring that Julian Vance's final splash in Lochdubh didn't wash away the very people he had tried to replace. Hamish watched the solicitor's retreating figure vanish into the grey curtain of the drizzle, the heavy oilskin making Forbes look like a shadow that had finally detached itself from the stone walls of the harbour. The spanner lay in the gravel, a cold piece of iron that was the only evidence of the violence that had simmered beneath the surface of a property dispute. Hamish didn't pick it up. He knew that in Lochdubh, the truth was often more effective when it was discovered by accident rather than presented as a gift. He whistled low for Lugs, who was sniffing at the spot where the bicycle had stood, and began the slow, measured trek back toward the village centre. The plan was forming in his mind, a delicate piece of Highland theatre that required Blair's vanity to be the primary engine of its own destruction. He needed the DCI to think he had uncovered a conspiracy so vast and so clever that only a detective of his monumental stature could unravel it. To do that, Hamish had to play the part of the bumbling local to perfection, planting the seeds of doubt so deeply that Blair would be convinced they were his own original thoughts. As he reached the police station, the light from the windows spilled out onto the mud, illuminating a scene of continued chaos. Blair's voice was still a rhythmic boom, though it had taken on a hoarse, strained quality that suggested he had been shouting at Geordie Curry for several hours without pause. Hamish entered the side door, slipping into the back room where the evidence from the chapel was being kept. Anderson and McLean were in the main office, their heads bent over a map of the glen, looking thoroughly bored and exhausted. Hamish moved with the silence of a ghost, his eyes scanning the table where Vance's personal effects were laid out. There was the shattered gin bottle, the tangled velvet rope, and the silver stag pin that had been the proof of Geordie's guilt. Beside these sat the kilt, a crumpled heap of tartan that smelled of mothballs and London dry gin. Hamish reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, old-fashioned brass key he had borrowed from the vestry earlier in the afternoon, a key that fitted the old heavy trunk in the solicitor's office where the real parish records were kept. He placed it among Vance's keys, making it look as though it had been there all along, a silent invitation for someone to wonder what it opened. He then walked into the main office, adopting a look of profound, wide-eyed confusion that made him appear even more vacant than usual. "Och, sir," he said, interrupting one of Blair's more creative insults directed at Geordie, "I've been doing a bit of thinking, and I'm afraid I've made a terrible mess of things. I was out looking for that lost cat I mentioned, and I found something in the bushes behind the post office. It's an old bicycle, a rusted thing, and it has a black oilskin draped over the handlebars, just like the one the old minister used to wear." Blair stopped mid-sentence, his face turning a shade of purple that suggested a looming medical emergency. He stomped on Hamish, his eyes bulging. "A bicycle? An oilskin? What, in the name of God, does that have to do with a robbery homicide, you lanky peasant? I have the suspect right here. He had the pin in his pocket. Case closed." Hamish scratched his head, looking at his boots. "Aye, sir, I'm sure you're right. It's just, well, Geordie can't bike, you see. He has the balance of a dizzy sheep. And that silver pin. The village smithy was telling me earlier that it looks remarkably like the ones Arthur Forbes has on his display case in the office. He said he fixed his set last month. I suppose it's just a coincidence that the bicycle was seen heading toward the chapel right before the bell rang. A ghost, most likely. The hills are full of them, as the old folks say. The silence that followed was heavy and laden with the sound of Blair's breathing. Hamish watched the DCI's eyes. He could see the moment the gears began to shift, the realization that a robbery by a local thief was a small tawdry prize compared to the professional fraud and murder by a high-society solicitor. To Blair, the prospect of taking down a man like Forbes was like being offered a seat at the high table of the Strathbane elite. "Forbes," Blair whispered, the name sounding like a prayer. He turned to Anderson, his anger replaced by a sharp, predatory cunning. "Anderson, why didn't you tell me Forbes was involved in the property dispute? Why wasn't I informed about the stag pins?" Anderson blinked, eyeing Hamish and then Blair. "But, sir, we didn't know—" "Silence!" Blair roared, his energy renewed. "I knew it! I knew the boy was too small for such a job. He's just a runner. Forbes used him. He planted the pin to cover his tracks. It's a conspiracy, Anderson. A legal conspiracy to defraud a London investor." He turned to Hamish, pointing a shaking finger. "You, Macbeth, take me to this bicycle, and then we're going to Forbes's office. I want every ledger, every record, and every scrap of paper. We're going to bust this wide open, and when we do, I'll be the one the Commissioner is calling for the press conference." Hamish nodded dutifully, hiding his satisfaction behind a mask of dull compliance. "Whatever you say, sir. I'm sure you've figured it all out. I'll just go get the torch. It's a bit dark behind the post office." As they headed out into the rain, Blair leading the charge like a deranged general, Hamish fell in behind him, lugs trotting at his heels. The trap was set. By guiding Blair toward the bicycle and the solicitor's office, Hamish was ensuring that the city man's justice would be focused on the real secrets, the forged records and the property fraud, rather than the desperate act of a man who had tried to save a name. Blair would find the brass key. He would find the hidden ledgers, and he would be so busy patting himself on the back for solving the McRae conspiracy that he wouldn't look too closely at the mechanics of the rope. The village was silent as they marched through the sleet, the only sound the heavy thud of Blair's boots and the distant rhythmic slap of the loch against the pier. Hamish looked up at the crag, where the old chapel stood like a sentinel in the dark. The bell was quiet now, its work done. Julian Vance had come to Lochdubh to build a distillery on top of a history he didn't understand, and in doing so, he had triggered a defence mechanism as old as the hills themselves. As they rounded the corner toward the post office, Hamish saw the glint of the rusted metal in the shadows. He had done his part, he had protected the village from a wrongful arrest, and he had ensured that the truth would come out in a way that satisfied the law without destroying the community. Now, he just had to survive the next few hours of Blair's ego, a task that required more patience than any salmon fishing. He adjusted his cap, the lazy policeman once again the invisible hand guiding the storm, ready to watch the circus reach its inevitable shouting conclusion. The trek toward the solicitor's office was a miserable, squelching journey through the heart of a village that had collectively decided to draw its curtains and wait for the shouting to end. DCI Blair marched at the front of the small, bedraggled squad. His chest puffed out so far that his raincoat buttons strained against the Highland wind. He was a man possessed by the scent of a higher-tier arrest. The prospect of dragging a respected solicitor into the light of a murder charge acting on him like a shot of cheap brandy. Behind him, Hamish Macbeth plodded with a deceptive, heavy-footed gait, his torch beam dancing over the puddles. He looked for all the world like a man who was only there to ensure nobody tripped over a curb, while in reality his mind was tightly coiled, waiting for the moment the solicitor's desperation would finally snap. Arthur Forbes was not a man built for the rigours of a police interrogation, and if Blair's bull-in-a-china-shop approach collided with Forbes's fragile nerves, the result would be a messy, violent explosion that could leave more than just a reputation in ruins. They reached the solicitor's office, a narrow stone building squeezed between the chemist and the drapery, its windows dark and uninviting. Blair didn't bother with the bell. He hammered on the door with the base of his fist, the sound echoing through the empty street like a drumbeat of doom. "Forbes, open up! Police! I know you're in there, you paper-shuffling murderer!" There was no immediate answer, only the sound of the wind whistling through the eaves. Blair turned to Anderson, his face twisted into a mask of pure, impatient malice. "Break it down! I'm not waiting for an invitation to a funeral." Before Anderson could move, however, the lock turned with a slow, agonizing creak, and the door swung inward. Arthur Forbes stood in the hallway, still wearing the black oilskin, though it was now unzipped to reveal a waistcoat that was missing several buttons. He looked like a man who had been trying to scrub the world off his skin and failed. The confrontation didn't happen in the hallway, It happened in the cramped, paper-strewn sanctuary of the inner office. Blair pushed past Forbes, his eyes instantly locking onto the heavy brass key Hamish had found and placed in the evidence bag earlier. "Where is it, Forbes?" Blair snarled, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "The trunk, the records, the proof that you've been bled dry by a Londoner who was smarter than you." Forbes didn't answer. He backed away toward his desk, his hands fumbling blindly behind him for something among the stacks of legal briefs. He looked at Hamish, a silent plea for the mercy they had discussed at the pier. But Hamish remained a shadow in the corner, his face a mask of official, dull neutrality. The time for whispers was over, the trap was now physical, and it was closing fast. "You think you're so clever," Forbes hissed, his voice cracking like dry parchment. "You come in here with your boots and your noise, and you think you understand what it means to protect a village. Vance was a thief. He was going to take everything." As Blair moved toward him, Forbes's hand finally found what it was seeking. He didn't pull out a gun. He pulled out a heavy, silver-topped cane, a gift from the MC Ray estate years ago, and swung it with a frantic, uncoordinated strength born of pure terror. The silver top caught Blair on the shoulder, sending the DCI staggering back into a filing cabinet with a roar of pain and surprise. "Get him!" Blair bellowed, clutching his arm. "He's attacking an officer! He's resisting arrest!" The office became a chaotic blur of grey shadows and the smell of old paper. Anderson and McLean lunged for the solicitor, but Forbes, driven by a sudden manic energy, scrambled over his desk, kicking over a lamp that shattered on the floor, plunging the room into a flickering, shadowy half-light. He was heading for the back window, a desperate animal trying to reach the darkness of the hills. Hamish realized with a jolt that if Forbes escaped into the mist, he'd either fall off the crag or vanish forever, leaving the case a tangled mess that Blair would never be able to untie. With a sudden burst of speed that contradicted his lazy reputation, Hamish moved. He didn't run, he glided through the narrow gap between the shelves, his long arms reaching out like the jaws of a trap. He caught Forbes by the collar of the oilskin just as the solicitor was hoisting himself onto the windowsill. The weight of the two men brought them both crashing down onto a pile of archive boxes, the cardboard buckling under the impact. Forbes fought with a wiry, frantic strength, his fingernails clawing at Hamish's sleeves, his breath coming in ragged, sobbing gasps. "Let me go, Macbeth! Let me go! I won't go to town! I won't let them laugh at the name!" Hamish didn't use his fists. He used his weight and his reach, pinning the smaller man to the floor with a calm, relentless pressure. He spoke into Forbes's ear, his voice a low, steadying hum that was for the solicitor's ears alone. "It's over, Arthur. The bell has rung. Don't make it worse for John. Don't make it a spectacle." The fight went out of Forbes as suddenly as if a candle had been snuffed. He went limp in Hamish's grip, his face pressed against the dusty floorboards, weeping with a quiet, hollow sound that made Anderson and McLean pause in their advance. Blair, meanwhile, had recovered his footing and was stomping over, his face a vivid, pulsating purple. He reached down and yanked Forbes up by the arms, clicking the handcuffs onto the solicitor's wrists, with a savage, triumphant snap. "Got you! You're finished, Forbes. You and your clans and your heritage. You're just a common killer in a fancy coat." He turned to Hamish, his eyes glittering with a mixture of rage and grudging respect that he'd never admit to. "Not bad, Macbeth. You finally did something useful, though you nearly let him out the window with your fumbling." Hamish stood up, dusting off his trousers and adjusting his cap. He looked at the wreckage of the office, the shattered lamp, the scattered papers, and the broken man who was now being led toward the door by the two detectives. He felt no triumph, only a heavy, salt-tasted weariness. He had caught the killer, he had saved the boy Geordie, and he had secured the records that would protect John MacRae's peace. But the price had been the total destruction of a man who had tried to do a dark deed for an old reason. "I'll just stay and tidy up the glass, sir," Hamish said, his voice dropping back into its slow Highland lilt. "Wouldn't want anyone to cut themselves in the morning." Blair didn't even hear him. He was already halfway out the door, shouting into his radio about a high-level capture and a solved conspiracy. Hamish stood alone in the darkening office, lugs peering in from the hallway, and realized that the loudest part of the investigation was over. Now, only the silence remained, and the delicate task of making sure the credit went exactly where it was needed to keep him right where he was. The office was a graveyard of discarded ambitions and shredded dignity. As the heavy tread of Blair's boots faded down the hallway, taking the sobbing solicitor toward the waiting police car, Hamish Macbeth remained in the centre of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of Arthur Forbes's life. He moved slowly, his tall frame stooping to pick up the silver-topped cane that had nearly ended Blair's career in a burst of geriatric fury. He set it carefully on the desk, right next to the brass key that had served as the silent witness to the evening's events. The silence that followed the storm was absolute, broken only by the steady rhythmic dripping of rain from the eaves outside. Hamish looked at the heavy archives, knowing that within those boxes lay the future of John MacRae and the quiet dignity of a clan that refused to be sold. He had done the work, but now came the most dangerous part of any Highland investigation, the aftermath of success. DCI Blair returned to the room minutes later, his face glowing with a triumphant, febrile energy that suggested he was already drafting the headlines for the Strathbane Gazette. He was adjusting his tie, his earlier pain forgotten in the intoxicating rush of a high-profile capture. He looked at Hamish, who was currently occupied with a duster, appearing for all the world like a man whose greatest concern was the accumulation of soot on the solicitor's lampshade. "Well, Macbeth," Blair barked, his voice echoing off the narrow walls, "I hope you've learned something tonight. This is how real police work is done. It's about instinct. It's about knowing the criminal mind before the criminal even knows it themselves. I knew the moment I saw that kilt that we were dealing with a local power struggle, not some random theft." Hamish paused, looking at Blair with an expression of wide-eyed, bovine admiration that would have made a theatre actor weep with envy. "Oh, sir, it was a marvel to watch," Hamish said, his voice thick with a Highland lilt that suggested a brain made of wool. "The way you saw through that silver pin, I'd have just thought it was a bit of jewellery, but you knew it was a signature. And the bicycle! I'd have never thought to connect an old rusted bike to a man of Mr. Forbes's standing if you hadn't been dropping hints about the minister's ghost all afternoon. It's a terrifying thing, the mind of a city detective." Blair puffed out his chest, his thumbs hooked into his waistcoat. The flattery was like a warm bath to his ego, washing away any lingering suspicion that Hamish had been the one pulling the strings. "It's a gift, Macbeth. You either have it or you don't. You, unfortunately, have a gift for finding salmon and losing your car keys. But I'll give you this much, you didn't completely botch the arrest. I'll make sure to mention in my report that you were present, providing backup while I tackled the suspect." He looked around the room, his eyes landing on the brass key and the open ledgers. "I'll be taking these, of course. They're the smoking gun. Fraud, embezzlement and murder. It's the trifecta of a career-making case. I expect the Chief Constable will want to see me personally by Monday." "I'm sure he will, sir," Hamish said, nodding vigorously. "A man of your talents is wasted in the backwaters of Lochdubh. I was saying to Anderson only a moment ago that it's a pity you don't have a permanent office in Edinburgh. A case like this, why, they'll probably be wanting to promote you to superintendent before the month is out. You'll be so busy with the big city crimes that you'll never have to look at a Highland mist again." Hamish watched Blair's face closely. The bait was set. The one thing Blair wanted more than a result was to be as far away from the smelly peasants of the north as possible, by inflating the importance of the case and framing it as a ticket to a metropolitan promotion. Hamish was ensuring that Blair would claim every single ounce of credit. If Blair admitted that a local constable had done the thinking, it would dilute his own brilliance. Blair nodded, a look of profound, self-important solemnity crossing his features. "Yes, it is a burden, Macbeth, but someone has to do it. The city is a jungle, and it needs a hunter. I'll be leaving at first light. I want the final statements typed up and on my desk in Strathbane by noon. I don't want any local colour in them, understood? Just the facts as I've laid them out. The solicitor was cornered by my strategic deployment of evidence and confessed during a tactical confrontation led by myself. He turned toward the door, then paused, looking back at the lanky policeman who was now trying to fix a broken archive box with a bit of string. "And Macbeth, don't go getting ideas. You're a useful enough fetch-and-carry man, but don't think this makes you a detective. Stay in your lane, or you'll find yourself directing traffic in the rain for the rest of your miserable life." "I wouldn't dream of it, sir," Hamish said, his voice a whisper of humility. "I'm just happy to have been of service to such a distinguished officer. I'll stay here and finish tidying. You've a long drive ahead, and the press will be waiting." As Blair finally vanished into the night, his car tires throwing up a final arrogant spray of mud against the office windows, Hamish let out a long, slow breath that seemed to deflate his entire body. He sat in the lawyer's chair, the silence of the room returning like a long-lost friend. Luggs emerged from the hallway, his ears twitching with curiosity, and rested his heavy head on Hamish's knee. He had won. To the world, DCI Blair was the hero of the Macquarie conspiracy, the man who had brought down a corrupt solicitor and solved the mystery of the chapel bell. To the village, Hamish was still the lazy, useless Bobby, who had spent the most exciting day of the year avoiding work and getting in the way. It was a perfect arrangement. The promotion that had loomed like a dark cloud over his beloved hills had been diverted into Blair's waiting arms, and the secrets of Lochdubh were safe once again. He looked at the empty room, feeling the exhaustion of the day finally settle into his joints. The Sassenach was dead, the killer was caught, and the only person who truly knew why was a man who preferred the company of a dog to the praise of a commissioner. He reached out and stroked Luggs's head, his hazel eyes fixed on the flickering embers of the dying fire. The credit was gone, and for Hamish Macbeth, that was the greatest victory of all. He stood up, picked up his cap, and prepared to walk back to his quiet station, ready to return to the life that Blair so despised and Hamish so dearly loved. The morning sun struggled to penetrate the thick, violet-tinged Highland mist, eventually settling for a pale, watery glow that made the wet slate roofs of Lochdubh shimmer like the scales of a salmon. The village was finally quiet. The aggressive thrum of police engines and the discordant shouts of city detectives having retreated south towards Strathbane with the dawn. Hamish Macbeth stood on the doorstep of the police station, a chipped mug of coffee cradled in his hands, watching the last of the puddles ripple in the wake of the departing press cars. DCI Blair was gone, his car weighed down by a mountain of evidence, a broken solicitor, and an ego that had grown to such a size it was a wonder the tires didn't pop. The headlines would be glorious, the commendations would be many, and Blair would be far too busy posing for photographers to ever consider why a certain lanky constable was still manning a lonely outpost in the hills. Hamish let out a long, weary sigh of pure contentment, the steam from his coffee fogging his vision for a moment. Beside him, Luggs let out a low, satisfied ruff, his massive ears twitching at the familiar, peaceful sounds of the village waking up. The postman's bicycle creaked in the distance. The real postman, not a ghost in an oilskin, and the smell of frying bacon began to drift from the hotel kitchens. The drama of Julian Vance's short-lived dynasty had been folded away into a series of official reports, and Lochdubh was already beginning to digest the scandal, turning it into the kind of local legend that would be polished and embellished over pints of Guinness for the next 20 years. "Well, Luggs," Hamish murmured, scratching the dog behind a particularly impressive ear, "we're still here, and more importantly, we're still invisible." He turned back into the station, the familiar scent of floor wax and old paper wrapping around him like a comfortable, worn-out sweater. The office was empty, the silence absolute. He walked over to the desk and picked up the black telephone receiver, which had been buzzing with frantic inquiries from headquarters all night. He placed it back on its cradle with a deliberate, slow movement. The world could wait. His shift was technically over, and the only detecting he planned to do for the rest of the day involved the exact location of a particularly stubborn trout he had been tracking near the old stone bridge. He moved into the small kitchen at the back of the station, his movements slow and economical. He hadn't eaten since the previous morning, and his stomach was beginning to vocalize its displeasure with a series of hollow groans. He found a half loaf of bread, a bit of salted butter, and a single lonely egg that had survived the week. As he cracked the egg into a blackened iron skillet, the sizzle of the fat sounded better than any press conference. He stood by the stove, his eyes fixed on the window, watching a pair of golden eagles circle high above the crag where the old chapel stood. The bell wouldn't ring today. The Macquarie secret was safe, the records were in hands that understood their value, and the Sassenach who had tried to buy the soul of the glen was just a memory. There was a light, rhythmic tapping at the back door. Hamish didn't reach for his belt or his cap. He knew that particular knock. It was Priscilla Halberton Smythe, likely coming to see if he had been promoted, fired, or simply forgotten in the wake of the Blair triumph. He opened the door, and she stepped inside, looking as cool and elegant as a winter morning in a cashmere coat that smelled of wood smoke and expensive perfume. She looked at his bruised face, his torn sleeve, and the humble egg frying in the pan, and a faint, knowing smile touched her lips. "I see you've survived the hero of the hour," she said, her voice a soft, melodic contrast to the morning silence. "Daddy says the papers are already calling it the Blair breakthrough. Apparently he wrestled a desperate killer to the ground, while his local deputy watched in awe." Hamish flipped the egg, his expression one of vacant, rural humility. "Oh, it was a terrifying thing to see, Priscilla. I'm just a simple bobby. My legs went to jelly the moment I saw the cane. It's a mercy we have men like Blair to keep the hills safe from solicitors. I'm just happy to be back at my stove without a promotion to worry about." Priscilla laughed, a silver sound that filled the small kitchen. She reached out and straightened his collar, her eyes searching his face for the flicker of the man she knew was hidden behind the act. "You're a terrible liar, Hamish Macbeth, but I suppose it's a useful trait. John MacRae stopped by the castle this morning. He wanted me to give you something. He said it was old iron that didn't belong in the harbour." She reached into her pocket and pulled out the rusted brass key to the parish trunk. Hamish accepted it, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting second, and felt a quiet sense of closure. The key was a symbol of a trust kept and a village protected. He tucked it into his pants pocket, right next to his fishing line. "He's a good man, John," Hamish said softly. "He just wants to be left alone with the sea, and I think he will be now." Priscilla watched him for a moment longer, then turned toward the door. "I'm going to London for a few weeks, Hamish. Try not to let any more millionaires get strangled while I'm away. I don't think Lochdubh could take the excitement." As she vanished into the mist, leaving the station feeling a little colder and a lot emptier, Hamish sat down at his small kitchen table. He ate his egg and toast in the quiet company of lugs, the only sound the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. He was tired, his ribs ached from the struggle in the office, and his bank account was as thin as ever. But as he looked out at the mountains, which were now shedding their violet coats for a brilliant, sun-drenched green, he knew he had won the only battle that mattered. He was still the Constable of Lochdubh. He was still the man who knew the secrets of the stones and the language of the water. And most importantly, as he leaned back and closed his eyes, he realized that for the first time in 3 days, the only sound in the glen was the peaceful, unhurried breath of the Highlands returning to sleep. The circus was gone, the Sassenach was buried, and Hamish Macbeth was exactly where he was meant to be, right in the middle of nowhere, with everything he ever needed. The sun finally crested the ridge of the hills, flooding the police station with a warmth that felt like a quiet benediction. Hamish finished his tea, the last dregs of the brew tasting of peat and victory, and stood up to stretch his long, aching limbs. He looked at the empty desk where Blair had held court, now cleared of its files and its fury, and felt a profound sense of relief. The village of Lochdubh had survived its brief brush with the modern world, and like the ancient granite that formed its foundation, it remained unchanged. Julian Vance's Ferrari was gone, Arthur Forbes was headed for a cell, and the MC Ray name would remain a whisper in the wind rather than a line in a corporate ledger. He moved to the small wooden board where he kept the station keys and hung the heavy brass key to the parish trunk on a nameless hook in the back, hidden behind a stack of old reports. It was a secret that would stay in the station, a bridge between the law and the land that only he understood. He then whistled for Lugs, who was already waiting by the door, his tail thumping a rhythmic greeting against the doorframe. The dog knew the signs. The uniform cap was being replaced by the old tweed hat, and the heavy boots were being swapped for the lighter walking ones. The investigation was over, but the day was just beginning. As he walked down the main street, the villagers were emerging from their cottages, the air filled with the familiar comforting sounds of a Highland morning. Mrs. Kennedy was sweeping the front of the post office, her eyes sharp and curious, but she only gave Hamish a brief, respectful nod. She knew better than to ask for the details that weren't in the papers. In Lochdubh, a silent policeman was worth 10 who liked to talk. He passed the spice of Lochdubh, where Mr. Patel was already setting out his chalkboard, and caught the scent of frying onions and turmeric. The world was returning to its natural order, a delicate balance of gossip, work, and the steady, unhurried passage of time. He reached the old stone bridge where the river ran deep and dark, swirling around the ancient mossy pilings. He leaned against the parapet, looking down into the amber water. He could see the flash of a silver belly as a trout darted between the rocks, and for a moment the memory of the struggle in the solicitor's office felt like a dream from another life. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a failure. He was just a part of the landscape, as much a fixture of the glen as the heather and the mist. He had protected his territory, not out of a sense of duty to the Commissioner, but out of a deep, abiding love for the people and the peace that Blair so thoroughly despised. A shadow fell across the bridge, and Hamish turned to see John Mac Rae standing there, his hands deep in the pockets of his worn trousers. The old man didn't speak. He simply looked out at the water, his face a mask of weathered tranquillity. After a long minute he reached into his pocket, pulled out a small silver flask, and handed it to Hamish. It was engraved with a tiny, faded stag, the true crest of the MC Rays, a piece of history that Vance had never found. Hamish took a small sip of the whiskey. It was old, smooth, and tasted of smoke and the sea. He handed it back, and John nodded once, a gesture of absolute finality. The debt was settled, the name was safe, and the silence was restored. "It's a fine morning, John," Hamish said, his voice a soft, rhythmic lilt. "Aye, Macbeth," the old man replied, his voice like the grinding of pebbles. "It is that." John turned and walked away toward the harbour, his step a little lighter than it had been the day before. Hamish watched him go, then turned his gaze back to the hills. He knew Blair would be at a press conference by now, basking in the glow of a captured killer and a solved conspiracy. He knew that the lawyers would be arguing over Vance's estate for years, and that eventually someone else would come to Lochdubh with a shiny car and a loud voice, looking to improve the Highlands. But until that day came, Hamish Macbeth was the master of his own quiet domain. He adjusted his hat and whistled for Lugs, who was investigating a particularly interesting scent near the water's edge. He had no paperwork to finish, no superiors to pacify, and no crimes to solve. He was just a man with a dog and a river, and in the grand scheme of things he realized that was more than enough. He began to walk toward the higher paths, his stride long and easy, disappearing into the violet shadows of the mountains. The chapel bell had rung its piece, the Sassenach had played his part, and the Highlands had reclaimed their own. As the mist finally cleared, revealing the brilliant, heart-aching green of the glen, Hamish Macbeth smiled a small, secret smile. He was home, he was safe, and most importantly, he was still exactly who he wanted to be.